The red and blue lights of the police cruisers strobed silently against the fresh snow on my front lawn, casting long, erratic shadows across the living room wall. I sat in my favorite armchair, the one my mother had tried to throw out 3 times, holding a mug of chamomile tea. The house was finally quiet, the kind of absolute, ringing silence that only comes after a deafening storm. I took a slow sip of the tea, letting the warmth spread through my chest, chasing away the chill of the December night. I am 32 years old. My name is Chloe Bennett. And just 20 minutes ago, I stood on this very porch and watched 2 police officers escort my own parents, Arthur and Margaret Bennett, out of my home. If you had told me a year ago that I would be the one handing them eviction papers on Christmas Eve, I would have thought you were insane. I was the good daughter, the reliable one, the one who always did what was expected, who swallowed her pride, who kept the peace at all costs. But peace is a dangerous illusion when you are the only one paying the price for it. To understand how a daughter reaches the point of throwing her own flesh and blood out into the winter cold, you have to understand how the invasion began. It wasn't with a violent breach of the door. It was with tears, soft words, and the heavy, suffocating blanket of family duty. It started exactly 14 months ago, October. The leaves were turning brilliant shades of gold and crimson across upstate New York. It was the proudest month of my life. After a decade of working 60-hour weeks at a corporate logistics firm, driving a beat-up sedan, and eating ramen noodles more nights than I care to admit, I had finally saved enough for a 20% down payment. I bought my first house. It was a beautiful, traditional 4-bedroom colonial in a quiet, leafy suburb. It had a wraparound porch, a sprawling backyard bordered by ancient oak trees, and a kitchen bathed in morning sunlight. When I signed the closing papers, my hand trembled. I was a 32-year-old single woman, and I had done it entirely on my own. My credit score was immaculate. The 30-year fixed mortgage was solely in my name, and the deed was mine. I imagined filling the guest rooms with friends during the holidays. I pictured reading books by the brick fireplace. Most of all, I imagined the look of sheer pride on my parents' faces when I gave them the grand tour. I had always been the quiet achiever, living in the shadow of my younger brother, Mason. Mason was the golden boy, charming, reckless, always dreaming up the next big startup idea that never quite materialized. I thought this house would be the thing that finally made my parents look at me and say, "Chloe, you did wonderfully. We are so proud of you." I hosted a small housewarming dinner the first week I moved in. I spent 2 days cooking. I roasted a chicken with rosemary from my new garden, baked a fresh apple pie, and bought a bottle of wine that was far outside my usual budget. When my parents arrived, my heart fluttered with anticipation. My mother, Margaret, stepped into the foyer. She was a woman who always looked impeccably put together, her silver hair perfectly styled, wearing her signature pearl earrings. She didn't take off her coat immediately. Instead, she ran a finger along the edge of the entryway console table, inspecting for dust. "Well, Chloe," she said, her tone carrying that specific pitch of measured approval. "It's certainly very ambitious for a single girl." My father, Arthur, stood behind her, adjusting his glasses. "The property taxes in this county are brutal, kiddo. I hope you know what you're doing. You've got mature trees out back. That's a liability. Roots destroy foundations." There was no hug, no congratulations, just an immediate assessment of the risks I had taken. I swallowed the lump in my throat, forcing a bright smile. "It's structurally sound, Dad. I had it inspected, and I have a great rate. Come on in, dinner is ready." The dinner was strained. My mother picked at the roasted chicken, mentioning casually how she preferred her poultry brined overnight, while my father dominated the conversation by talking about Mason's latest venture. An app for pet owners that had 0 revenue, but according to my father, limitless potential. When they left that evening, the house felt a little less warm, but I brushed it off. That was just how they were. I told myself I was being too sensitive. 3 weeks later, the phone call came. It was a Tuesday night. I was sitting at my kitchen island, reviewing some spreadsheets for work, when my phone vibrated. It was my mother. When I answered, she wasn't speaking. She was sobbing. A deep, breathless weeping that made my blood run cold. Mom, what's wrong? Is it Dad? Is someone hurt?" I panicked, nearly knocking my laptop off the counter. "Chloe." "Oh, Chloe, it's gone. It's all gone," she wailed, her voice cracking. My father took the phone. He sounded older, defeated, his voice a gravelly whisper. "Chloe, sweetie, we've had a massive financial setback. A terrible one." He spun a terrifying tale over the next 20 minutes. According to him, an aggressive real estate investment portfolio he had tied their retirement to had completely collapsed. The market had shifted, the developers had declared bankruptcy, and the bank was calling in their loans. "They're taking the house, Chloe," my father said, his voice breaking. "The house I grew up in. Our savings are wiped out. The lawyer says we have to liquidate everything to avoid federal charges. We have nothing. 30 years of hard work, just gone." I stopped breathing. The thought of my parents in their late 60s losing their home, standing on the street with nowhere to go, was unbearable. Every instinct of the dutiful daughter kicked into overdrive. The instinct that says family is blood, and you sacrifice whatever is necessary to protect them. "Dad, Mom, listen to me," I said, my voice steady despite the shaking of my hands. "You are not going to be on the street. You come here. I have 3 empty bedrooms. You come stay with me until you get back on your feet, as long as you need." "Oh, sweetie, we couldn't impose," my mother cried in the background. "A young woman needs her privacy. It's not an imposition, Mom, it's family. Pack whatever you can fit in the car. I'll come help you this weekend." Looking back, I realize how easily I laid my neck on the chopping block. I didn't ask to see the foreclosure notices. I didn't ask to speak to their lawyer. I just trusted them implicitly, because what kind of parents would lie about something so devastating to their own child? They arrived on a rainy Sunday afternoon. Their SUV was packed to the roof with designer suitcases, boxes of fine china, and my father's expensive golf clubs. For people who had supposedly lost everything, they certainly prioritized packing their luxury items. But I ignored that red flag. I helped them carry the boxes inside, clearing out my 2 largest guest rooms to accommodate them. I gave them the room with the best view of the garden, complete with an attached ensuite bathroom. I bought them fresh, high thread count sheets. I stocked the fridge with all their favorite foods, expensive cuts of salmon for my mother, imported cheeses, and the specific brand of organic almond milk my father preferred. I wanted to cushion their fall. I wanted them to feel safe. The first week was an adjustment, naturally. I expected grief. I expected them to be depressed about losing their independence. Instead, a strange, creeping entitlement began to settle over my house. It started with small things, almost invisible boundary crossings. I came home from a grueling 10-hour shift on a Thursday to find the heavy velvet blackout curtains I had carefully chosen for the living room stuffed into a trash bag in the hallway. In their place hung flimsy, floral-patterned drapes that looked like they belonged in a 1980s bed and breakfast. "Mom, what happened to my curtains?" I asked, dropping my briefcase on the floor. Margaret emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a pristine white apron, my apron. "Oh, darling, those heavy dark things were absolutely depressing. They had terrible feng shui. They were trapping all the negative energy in the house. I found these at a boutique downtown. They open up the space so much better, don't you think?" "Mom, I paid $300 for those blackout curtains because I get migraines and need the room dark sometimes," I said, trying to keep my voice even. She sighed, a long, dramatic sound that instantly made me feel like an unreasonable teenager. "Chloe, please don't fret over material things. We're trying to bring some light into our lives after the trauma we've just endured. I thought you'd be grateful I was helping make this huge, echoing house feel more like a home. But if it upsets you that much, I suppose I can dig your depressing rags out of the garbage." The guilt was instantaneous. She had just lost her home, and here I was, arguing over window treatments. "No, Mom, it's fine. Leave them. I was just surprised, that's all." That was the first battle I forfeited. It set the precedent for the war I didn't know I was fighting. By the end of the first month, my house no longer felt like mine. It was as if I had been demoted from homeowner to an unwanted lodger in a bed and breakfast run by my parents. The thermostat was a constant battleground. I liked the house at a crisp 68 degrees. Arthur insisted that anything below 74 exacerbated his joint pain. I would wake up sweating in the middle of the night, only to find the heat cranked up to a suffocating level. When the first utility bill arrived, it was double what I had budgeted. Then came the grocery bills. My parents didn't work, obviously. They spent their days researching legal options, which seemed to consist entirely of watching daytime television and browsing the internet. Since they were broke, I paid for everything. Every week, my mother would leave a meticulously detailed, handwritten grocery list on the kitchen island. It never included basic staples. It was always prime rib, artisanal sourdough, organic raspberries, and expensive supplements for my father. When I tried to gently suggest we tighten the grocery budget, pointing out that my mortgage was high and I was now supporting 3 adults on a single income, my father looked at me with deep disappointment. "Chloe," Arthur said, taking off his glasses and rubbing the bridge of his nose, "your mother's nerves are shattered. Good nutrition is the only thing keeping her health from failing completely. I didn't realize feeding your parents in their time of desperate need was such a financial burden on your successful single lifestyle. I suppose we can start eating canned beans if it helps your bank account." Again, the weaponized guilt. Again, I surrendered. I took on extra freelance logistics consulting on the weekends to cover the surging expenses. I was exhausted, burning the candle at both ends, while my parents lived a life of quiet leisure under my roof. The dynamic became increasingly toxic, masked by Southern-style passive-aggressive sweetness. Margaret was a master of the backhanded compliment. If I wore a comfortable sweater and jeans after a long day, she would say, "It's so brave of you to prioritize comfort over your appearance, Chloe. Not many women your age would just give up trying like that." If I ordered takeout because I was too tired to cook the elaborate meals they expected, she would sigh, "I suppose the preservatives in this are fine for a young metabolism. I just worry about your heart, darling." And then there was the Homeowners Association. I lived in a community with a strict HOA. We had rules about parking, lawn care, and noise. Arthur, accustomed to having a massive driveway at his old house, simply refused to park his oversized SUV in my garage, claiming it was too tight of a squeeze. Instead, he parked it horizontally across my driveway, partially blocking the sidewalk. When the first warning letter arrived from the HOA, I brought it to him. "Dad, you have to park in the garage or parallel on the street. The HOA is threatening to fine me." He barely looked up from the newspaper. "Those people are busybodies, Chloe. Petty tyrants with clipboards. Ignore them. I'm an older man. I'm not walking a block in the cold because some bored housewife doesn't like my bumper over the concrete." "Dad, they will fine me $50 a day. Then tell them you have elderly parents staying with you who need accommodations," he snapped. "Don't be such a pushover, Chloe. Stand up for your family." So I fought the HOA. I wrote emails. I attended a humiliating board meeting where I pleaded for a temporary variance, absorbing the judgmental stares of my neighbors. I burned my own social capital in my new neighborhood to protect my father's convenience. But the most painful part of the invasion wasn't the money, the curtains, or the HOA. It was the constant, unwavering presence of Mason in our conversations. Even while completely dependent on me, living in my house, eating my food, and spending my money, Arthur and Margaret's minds were entirely occupied by my brother. Mason lived 3 states away in a trendy loft running his tech startup. Every evening at dinner, the conversation revolved around him. "Mason called today," my mother would say, her eyes lighting up in a way they never did for me. "He's pitching to a new angel investor next week. Oh, the stress that poor boy is under. He works so incredibly hard." "He's a visionary," my father would agree, cutting into the steak I had purchased. "It takes time for genius to be recognized. The market just hasn't caught up to his ideas yet." I sat at the end of my own dining table, invisible. I wanted to scream, "I am here. I am the one putting a roof over your head. I am the one working 60 hours a week. Mason is 28 years old and has never held a job for more than 6 months. But I bit my tongue. I convinced myself that this was just a season, a temporary hardship. Once the lawyers sorted out their bankruptcy, they would get a small apartment, and I would get my life back. I clung to the belief that beneath their demanding exterior, my parents were just terrified, traumatized people who needed their daughter's grace. I was a fool. The illusion shattered in late November, right before Thanksgiving. It was a bleak, rainy Tuesday. A nor'easter was blowing through, lashing rain against the windows. I had taken a rare sick day from work, suffering from a severe sinus infection. My parents had gone out to meet with a financial counselor, or so they said. I suspected they were just going to the indoor mall to walk around and window shop, as they often did to avoid being cooped up. I needed an aspirin, but the bottle in my bathroom was empty. I remembered seeing a bulk bottle in the downstairs half bath, which my father had effectively commandeered as his personal medicine cabinet. My head throbbing, I shuffled downstairs in my bathrobe. The half bath was adjacent to my home office. When I had bought the house, the office was meant to be my sanctuary. It had built-in mahogany bookshelves and a beautiful bay window. Now, it was Arthur's war room, filled with scattered papers, files, and an old leather armchair he had insisted I move in there for his back. I walked into the bathroom, rummaging through the drawers for the aspirin. I didn't find it. Thinking maybe it had rolled off the counter, I stepped out and glanced into the office. On my desk, the desk I paid for in the house I owned, was a stack of my father's thick leather binders. He was incredibly meticulous about his paperwork, always locking things away in a heavy fireproof safe he had insisted on keeping in the closet. But today, perhaps rushing to leave, he had left one of the binders sitting precariously on the edge of the desk. As I walked past the desk to check the lower drawers, the sleeve of my thick bathrobe caught the corner of the leather binder. It fell to the hardwood floor with a heavy thud. The clasp broke open, and a cascade of documents, manila envelopes, and bank statements spilled across the rug. "Damn it," I muttered, my head pulsing with pain as I knelt down to gather the papers. I started scooping them up blindly, just wanting to shove them back in and close the clasp. I didn't want to pry. I had never looked through their financial papers. I felt it was a violation of their dignity, especially considering their supposed ruin. But as I grabbed a handful of documents, a specific official-looking form caught my eye. It was printed on thick, watermarked paper. At the top, in bold black letters, it read, Form 1099-S, proceeds from real estate transactions. My hands stopped moving. My breath hitched in my throat. I knew what a 1099-S was. I had just filed one when I purchased this house. It's the tax form used to report the sale of a property. I looked at the date. It was dated August 15th of this year, just 2 months before they called me crying about losing their home to the bank. My eyes scanned down the page. Filer, First National Title Company. Transferor, Arthur and Margaret Bennett. Gross proceeds, $650,000. I sat back on my heels, the paper trembling in my hands. Gross proceeds, $650,000. Cash. There was no foreclosure. There was no bank seizing their assets. They had sold the family home themselves. My heart began to pound against my ribs like a trapped bird. The sinus pressure in my head vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp rush of adrenaline. I scrambled through the rest of the spilled papers. My previous respect for their privacy entirely evaporated. I found a manila envelope labeled Confidential, Banking. I ripped it open. Inside were the bank statements for their joint checking account from September. There it was, a deposit on August 18th for $612,400, after closing costs and the remaining small mortgage payoff. They were flush with cash. They had over $500,000 sitting in the bank just weeks before they moved into my house, claiming absolute destitution. But my eyes kept tracking down the statement. September 5th, a wire transfer out of the account. Outgoing wire transfer, Bennett Tech Solutions, LLC, amount $450,000. Memo, seed investment/personal loan, Bennett Tech Solutions, Mason's Company. I couldn't breathe. The air in the room felt too thick, too heavy. I stared at the numbers until they blurred together through hot, stinging tears. They hadn't lost their money in a bad real estate deal. They had willfully sold their home. They had taken the equity, 30 years of their lives, the safety net for their old age, and they had handed almost all of it to Mason to fund a failing pet app. And then, left with only a fraction of their wealth and unwilling to spend it on rent, they had concocted a story of catastrophic ruin. They had weaponized my love, my duty, and my empathy. They had moved into my home, eaten my food, driven up my bills, and allowed me to work myself to the bone, all to save their remaining cash. They were living rent-free with me so they could afford to bankroll my brother's delusions. I was not a daughter. I was a subsidy. I was a free hotel and a catering service. I sat on the floor of my home office for a long time, the rain lashing against the bay window, holding the proof of my own parents' betrayal. The grief I felt in that moment was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It wasn't the sharp, clean pain of a sudden loss. It was the sick, suffocating realization that my entire reality was built on a foundation of calculated manipulation. Every time my mother had sighed about the cost of groceries while sneaking prime rib into the cart. Every time my father had demanded I fight the HOA to protect his car. Every time they had sat at my table, eating food I worked overtime to pay for, praising Mason's hard work. It was all a lie, a massive, orchestrated, breathtakingly cruel lie. I didn't cry hysterically. I didn't scream. The betrayal was too deep for noise. Instead, a cold, hard knot formed in the dead center of my chest. Something inside me, the desperate, people-pleasing little girl who just wanted her parents to be proud of her, quietly died on that hardwood floor. I meticulously gathered the papers. I took out my phone and photographed the 1099-S form. I photographed the bank statement showing the wire transfer to Mason. I made sure the dates and amounts were perfectly in focus. Then, I put the papers back exactly as they had been. I secured the clasp of the leather binder, wiped my fingerprints off the cover with the sleeve of my bathrobe, and placed it back on the edge of the desk, precisely where it had been before it fell. I stood up. My legs felt heavy, but my mind was clearer than it had been in my entire life. I walked out of the office, went upstairs to my bedroom, and locked the door. I lay down on my bed, staring at the ceiling. I knew with absolute certainty that my life would never be the same. The invasion was over. Now, it was time for the war. The days that followed my discovery in the home office were a masterclass in compartmentalization. I woke up the next morning feeling as though a fever had broken, leaving behind a cold, sharp clarity. The weeping, desperate daughter who just wanted to be loved was gone. In her place was a homeowner, a taxpayer, and a woman who had been defrauded of her sanctuary. I didn't confront them immediately. Confrontation without preparation is just noise, and my parents were experts at twisting noise into a symphony of their own victimhood. Instead, I went to work. I took a personal day and drove 2 towns over to sit in the austere, mahogany-paneled office of a no-nonsense real estate attorney named Mr. Sterling. I laid the photographs of the 1099-S form and the bank wire transfers on his desk. I explained the situation, the supposed bankruptcy, the emotional manipulation, the complete takeover of my property, and the undeniable proof that they were sitting on hundreds of thousands of dollars while bleeding me dry. Mr. Sterling looked at the documents, then looked at me over the rim of his reading glasses. He didn't offer pity, which I appreciated. He offered strategy. Legally, they are considered tenants at will, he explained, his voice even and professional. Because they have established residency here, even without a lease and without paying rent, you cannot simply change the locks. That would be an illegal eviction. You must serve them with a formal, written 30-day notice to vacate. If they do not leave after 30 days, we file an unlawful detainer lawsuit. 30 days. It felt like an eternity, but it was a ticking clock I desperately needed to start. I paid his retainer fee in cash, taking the heavily embossed, legally binding eviction notices he drafted for me. I put them in my briefcase, feeling the weight of them like a loaded weapon. When I returned home, the dynamic had shifted, though my parents didn't know it yet. I stopped arguing about the thermostat. I stopped apologizing for working late. When Margaret handed me a grocery list featuring imported truffles and wild-caught sea bass, I smiled, took the list, and came back with store-brand pasta and canned tuna. "Chloe, what on earth is this?" she gasped, looking into the grocery bags as if I had brought home toxic waste. "It's what I can afford, Mom," I said cheerfully, walking past her. "If you and Dad need specific dietary items, I'm sure you can find a way to manage it. My budget is tight right now." Arthur scowled from his armchair, but they said nothing. They couldn't push too hard without risking the free roof over their heads. The real test of my new resolve came 2 weeks later. Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving is the holiest of holidays in the Bennett family. It is the stage upon which my mother performs her grandest illusions of domestic perfection. This year, however, she had decided to escalate the charade. She informed me, a mere 4 days before the holiday, that she had invited Jessica's parents to join us. Jessica, my heavily pregnant sister-in-law, had moved into my master bedroom with Mason weeks ago, complaining that the stairs in their loft were too much for the baby. I had been relegated to the finished basement. It was clean and dry, but it was still a basement. It smelled faintly of concrete, and the small egress window offered a view of nothing but the undersides of the azalea bushes. "Jessica's parents are driving down from Connecticut," Margaret announced one evening, pouring herself a glass of my expensive Cabernet. They are lovely people, very successful. I want everything to be perfect, Chloe. I need you to do the turkey, the green bean casserole, your grandmother's sweet potato souffle, and the pecan pies. I simply don't have the stamina to stand in the kitchen all day with my nerves so frayed. A year ago, I would have run myself ragged trying to execute her perfect menu. Now I just nodded. Of course, Mom. I'll handle the cooking. On Thanksgiving Day, the house smelled heavenly. The scent of roasted sage, melting butter, and caramelized sugar filled the air. But my heart was a block of ice. I stayed in the kitchen, chopping, stirring, and basting, playing the role of the silent hired help. At 4 o'clock, the doorbell rang. Jessica's parents arrived, dripping in cashmere and polite condescension. They marveled at the house. "Arthur, Margaret, this home is just spectacular," Jessica's mother cooed in the foyer. "It's so wonderful that you have this beautiful estate to host the growing family." "Well, we try," Arthur boomed, playing the role of the gracious patriarch. He didn't correct her. He didn't mention that his name wasn't on the deed. He accepted the compliment as if he had laid every brick himself. I served the dinner. I brought out the massive golden brown turkey on my good china platter. I filled the crystal water goblets. The dining room table, which I had saved for 6 months to buy, was crowded with laughing, drinking people. There were 8 chairs at the table. Arthur, Margaret, Mason, Jessica, and Jessica's parents took 6. There was no place set for me. "Oh, Chloe," Margaret said, waving a manicured hand dismissively as I set down the last bowl of gravy. "There just wasn't enough room with the centerpiece. Be a dear and eat in the kitchen, will you? You can keep an eye on the pies." Mason didn't look up from his phone. Jessica giggled at something her father said. Arthur just reached for the mashed potatoes. It was the most blatant, breathtaking display of disrespect I had ever endured. But instead of the familiar sting of tears, I felt a surge of absolute power. The trap was set. They had just walked right into it. I didn't go to the kitchen. I walked over to the antique sideboard, opened the top drawer, and pulled out 4 thick manila envelopes. I walked back to the head of the table, standing right beside my father. The lively chatter began to die down as they noticed me standing there, silent and still. "Before we carve the turkey," Arthur announced, trying to ignore my looming presence, raising his crystal wine glass, "I want to propose a toast to family, to resilience, and especially to my son, Mason. Mason, your brilliance and your dedication to your company are an inspiration. You are the future of this family, and with the new baby coming, we couldn't be prouder of the man you've become. Cheers." "Cheers," the table echoed. As the glasses clinked, I calmly reached out and placed 1 manila envelope directly onto Arthur's dinner plate, right on top of his linen napkin. I placed the second in front of Margaret. The third went to Mason, and the fourth to Jessica. The silence that fell over the room was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop on the hardwood floor. "What is this, Chloe?" Arthur demanded, his face flushing a deep, angry red. "We are in the middle of a toast. Show some manners in front of our guests." "It's a legal document, Arthur," I said. My voice was steady, projecting clearly across the room. I didn't call him Dad. I don't think I ever will, again. "It is a formal 30-day notice to vacate the premises." Margaret gasped, her hand flying to her pearl necklace. Jessica's parents exchanged wide-eyed, horrified glances. "Have you lost your mind?" Mason snapped, half standing up from his chair. "You're trying to throw our parents out? On Thanksgiving? They have nothing. They lost their house." I smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of a woman who had just laid out a winning hand. "They didn't lose their house, Mason," I said smoothly. I reached into my apron pocket and pulled out a stack of color copies I had made at the local print shop. I tossed them onto the center of the table, right next to the gravy boat. "That is a copy of the 1099-S tax form from August," I announced, making sure my voice carried so Jessica's parents could hear every word. Arthur and Margaret sold their home for $650,000. They were not foreclosed on. They were not bankrupt. They took that money, and as you can see on the attached bank statement, they wired $450,000 of it directly to your LLC, Mason. Mason's jaw dropped. The color completely drained from his face. Jessica stared at him, her eyes wide with betrayal. She clearly hadn't known the extent of the cash infusion. "They took my empathy, my hard work, and my home, and they used it to subsidize your lifestyle while pretending to be destitute. I continued, my eyes locking onto my mother, who was now trembling. You have lived in my house rent-free. You have eaten the food I worked overtime to pay for. You have complained, you have demanded, and you have treated me like a servant in my own home. Chloe, please, Arthur stammered, the authoritative boom completely gone from his voice. We can explain. We were just trying to protect the family assets. We meant to pay you back when Mason's app took off. Your 30 days start today, I said, ignoring his pathetic backpedaling. If you are not out of this house, along with your son and his wife, by December 24th, my attorney will file an eviction lawsuit, and the sheriff will remove you by force. The dinner is served. Enjoy your turkey. I turned on my heel and walked down the stairs to the basement. I packed a small overnight bag, walked out the back door, and drove to a nice hotel downtown. I ordered room service, took a hot bath, and slept for 12 hours straight. When I returned the next day, the house was a war zone of tense, whispering silence. Jessica's parents had packed up and left before dessert, thoroughly horrified by the scandal. The grand facade was shattered, but if I thought my parents would simply pack their bags in shame and leave, I underestimated the depths of their entitlement. They didn't pack. They dug in. December arrived, bringing with it bitter cold and heavy snow. The 30-day clock was ticking down to Christmas Eve. Arthur and Margaret stopped speaking to me entirely, communicating only through glare and slammed doors. Mason and Jessica mostly hid in the master bedroom, the stress of the revealed secret clearly taking a toll on their marriage. On the morning of December 20th, just 4 days before the eviction deadline, I was drinking coffee in the kitchen when a white sedan pulled into my driveway, followed closely by a police cruiser. My stomach plummeted. I walked to the front door and opened it. 2 police officers and a stern-looking woman carrying a clipboard stood on my porch. Chloe Bennett? The woman asked. I am a caseworker with the county's Adult Protective Services. We received an emergency hotline call regarding the welfare of 2 elderly individuals residing in this home. Arthur and Margaret emerged from the living room. They looked awful. My mother hadn't done her hair, and she was wearing a faded, oversized cardigan. Arthur was leaning heavily on a cane I had never seen him use before. They looked like the picture of frail, terrified seniors. That's her, Margaret whimpered, pointing a trembling finger at me. She's been withholding food from us. She turned the heat off in our bedroom, and now she's trying to throw us out into the freezing snow for Christmas. We have nowhere to go, officer. We are penniless. It was a brilliant, terrifying tactical move. In many states, claiming elder abuse or claiming to be vulnerable tenants facing an illegal winter eviction can freeze a legal process for months. They were trying to use the state as their personal weapon to stay in my house. Ma'am, we need to ask you some questions, the taller police officer said, his hand resting casually on his utility belt. He looked at me with clear suspicion. Throwing your elderly, bankrupt parents out at Christmas was a bad look. I didn't panic. Mister, Sterling had warned me they might try something like this. He called it an extinction burst, the dramatic escalation of bad behavior when a manipulator realizes they are losing control. Officers, please come in out of the cold, I said calmly, stepping aside. I am happy to cooperate fully. They stepped into the foyer. I didn't offer them coffee. I went straight to the console table and picked up the thick binder I had prepared specifically for this moment. My parents are not destitute, nor are they victims of abuse, I said, handing the binder to the APS caseworker. Inside you will find notarized copies of their recent real estate sale, proving they possess over $150,000 in liquid assets. They are not penniless. The caseworker frowned, opening the binder and scanning the documents. The police officers exchanged a glance. You will also find utility bills proving the heat has been set to 72 degrees consistently, and grocery receipts totaling over $800 this month alone, I continued. Furthermore, if you would like to step into my home office, I can pull up the footage from my interior security cameras. Arthur's head snapped up. The fake limp disappeared. Cameras? You recorded us in our own home? In my home, Arthur, I corrected coldly. I had installed small, discreet cameras in the common areas the day after Thanksgiving, anticipating a false claim of abuse or property damage. I have footage of Margaret throwing my belongings, and footage of Arthur threatening me when I refused to give him my credit card. Would you like me to play it for the officers? The air went out of my parents' sails so fast it was almost palpable. The caseworker looked up from the bank statements, her expression shifting from sympathetic to irritated. Social workers are overworked and underpaid. They do not like being used as pawns by wealthy liars. Mr. and Mrs. Bennett, the caseworker said sharply, filing a false report with Adult Protective Services is a misdemeanor. These documents show you have ample financial resources to secure your own housing. This is a civil matter regarding a legal eviction, the police officer added, looking at my father with disgust. Ms. Bennett has served you with a lawful 30-day notice. If you are not out by the date on that paperwork, she can have the court dispatch the sheriff. We cannot force her to let you stay. I suggest you start packing. They left. The front door clicked shut, leaving a suffocating silence in its wake. The reality of their situation finally crashed down on them. They had played their last card, and they had lost. Panic set in. Mason came rushing down the stairs, having heard the police from the bedroom. He looked at the police cars driving away, then looked at his parents. "You called the cops on her?" Mason asked, his voice cracking with panic. "Are you insane? If this gets dragged into court, my investors will find out about the wire transfer. They'll think I'm laundering money. You're going to ruin my company." It was a beautiful, tragic irony. Arthur and Margaret had sacrificed me on the altar of Mason's success, and now, when they needed him most, Mason only cared about himself. "Mason, please," Margaret begged, grabbing his arm. "We have to be out by tomorrow night. We can't get an apartment that fast. Can we stay at the loft with you and Jessica? Just until the baby comes?" Mason pulled his arm away as if she had burned him. "Are you kidding? We don't have the space. Jessica is stressed enough as it is. Besides, you guys have cash. Go to a hotel." "We gave that cash to you," Arthur roared, his face purple. "It was an investment in the business," Mason shouted back. "It's tied up. I can't just pull it out to pay your rent. Jessica, get the bags. We're going back to the city tonight." Within 2 hours, Mason and Jessica had packed their SUV. They didn't say goodbye to me. More tellingly, they didn't offer a ride to the parents who had ruined their own lives to give them everything. I stood by the window and watched Mason drive away, leaving Arthur and Margaret standing in the driveway, looking older, smaller, and utterly broken. Which brings us to tonight, Christmas Eve, the deadline. They spent the last 2 days frantically packing their designer luggage. They didn't have a choice. I had Mr. Sterling on speed dial, and the local sheriff's department was fully aware of the situation. They knew they had nowhere to hide. They booked an extended stay hotel 2 towns over. At 7 p.m., the moving van they hired pulled away. Arthur and Margaret stood on the porch, waiting for their Uber. It was snowing lightly, the flakes sticking to Margaret's expensive wool coat. I opened the front door one last time. "Chloe," my mother said, her voice a fragile, trembling whisper. Real tears stood in her eyes this time. Not tears of manipulation, but tears of genuine grief for the daughter she finally realized she had lost forever. "How can you do this? How can you throw us away?" I looked at the woman who had birthed me, the woman who had spent 32 years making me feel like I was never quite enough. I felt no anger. I felt no triumph. I just felt tired. "I didn't throw you away, Mom," I said softly. "I just stopped letting you throw me away." I closed the door. I heard the lock click into place. A few minutes later, I saw the headlights of their ride sweep across the living room wall as it pulled out of the driveway. And now, I sit here in the quiet. The red and blue lights of the police cruiser that had randomly driven past my street earlier are gone. The snow is falling heavier now, a thick white blanket covering the tracks in the driveway, wiping the slate clean. I stand up from my armchair. I walk into the kitchen, the hardwood floors cold against my bare feet. I take out a bottle of wine, my favorite, not Margaret's. I pour a glass. I walk into the living room, strike a match, and light the fire in the brick fireplace. The wood crackles, throwing warm, golden light across the room. It illuminates the space where the ugly floral curtains used to be. Tomorrow, I will put my velvet ones back up. Tomorrow, I will clean out the master bedroom and reclaim my space. Tomorrow, I will wake up in a house that belongs entirely to me. Not all blood is family, and not all love requires you to burn yourself to the ground to keep someone else warm. I raise my glass to the empty, quiet, beautiful house. Merry Christmas to me.